Here's another health informatics, data, and AI. Talk about, well, you guessed it, AI.
And specifically,
Large language models, LLMs.
Yes.
We're seeing them everywhere these days.
Indeed. From chatbots to, well, things like ChatGPT, it seems like everyone's talking about them.
And the research world is no exception. Especially in medicine, the use of LLMs is really taking off.
There's so much potential there, so much to explore.
Exactly. And that's why we're doing a deep dive today into a new global study.
Oh, this should be interesting. What's the focus?
It looks at how medical and paramedical researchers all across the globe are using and thinking about these AI tools.
So getting a sense of what they're already doing with LLMs and where they see this tech headed.
You got it. Trying to answer those big questions. What are researchers using LLMs for?
And perhaps even more importantly, what are their concerns? What are they excited about?
Absolutely. So to set the scene, this study looked at 226 researchers from 59 countries.
Wow, that's a pretty diverse group.
Yeah, and they weren't just any researchers either.
Oh.
They were all participants in Harvard Medical School's Global Clinical Scholars Research Training Program.
So these are folks who are already deeply involved in research and really understand the methodologies.
Exactly. Not just casual users dabbling with ChatGPT. These are people who are serious about research, who are publishing, and who understand the nuances of the field.
That's really important, I think, because it gives us a much more insightful perspective on how LLMs are impacting, well, serious research, not just, what's making headlines.
I agree. And having that global perspective is key too, right? Seeing how researchers from different backgrounds and specialties are approaching this tech.
It definitely gives us a broader view of AI adoption trends, for sure.
Okay, so let's jump into some of the findings. One of the things that really struck me was that, get this, 87.6% of the researchers surveyed were already aware of LLMs.
Wow, that's a high percentage. So almost everyone in the study was at least familiar with the concept of LLMs.
Yeah, pretty much. Which, isn't too surprising, considering how much buzz there's been around AI in general.
True. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The study also found that those who were aware of LLMs were actually publishing more research.
Isn't that fascinating? Makes you wonder if there's a connection there.
It's definitely a correlation worth exploring. Could it be that researchers who are more actively publishing are also more likely to be, keeping up with the latest tools and technologies?
Maybe they're the ones who are actively searching for ways to, to be more efficient or to improve their work.
That's certainly possible. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe those who are publishing more are just more plugged into the research community,
where these tools are being discussed and shared and tested out.
Exactly. It's hard to say for sure what's driving that correlation, but it's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. Now, what I was really curious about was how they're actually using these tools. Is it actually changing how they approach research?
Right. Getting down to the nitty-gritty.
So the study looked at that too. And, well, here's the thing. While awareness of LLMs was high, the actual use in publications was still, well, relatively low.
How low are we talking?
Only 18.7% of the researchers said they had used LLMs in their published work.
Oh, that is lower than I would have expected. You'd think with all the hype, more researchers would be, jumping on the bandwagon.
Right. It's almost like there's this gap between awareness and adoption.
There's definitely a disconnect there.
Why do you think that is? Is it like fear of the unknown or just not knowing how to use these tools effectively?
Well, I think it's probably a combination of factors. First of all, remember, this technology is still pretty new, especially when we're talking about academic research.
That's true. It hasn't been around that long.
And most of the researchers in this study hadn't actually used LLMs before 2022.
So really just starting to experiment with them.
Right. So there's definitely a learning curve there. It takes time to figure out how to use these tools effectively and to integrate them into existing research practices.
It's one thing to play around with ChatGPT in your spare time. It's another to actually use it in a rigorous research project, right?
Absolutely. And then there's also the question of, how these tools fit into the established norms of research.
Right, like the ethics of using AI. We'll get into that more later, I'm sure. But for now, I'm curious about the 18.7% who are using LLMs. What are they actually using them for?
Well, according to the study, the most common uses were for things like, well, grammar and formatting.
So more like a writing assistant,
Yeah, exactly. And also for getting help with writing in general.
like composing sections of their papers.
Right. Basically, the tasks that can be really time consuming, but maybe don't require, that deep analytical thinking.
Like the more technical aspects of writing rather than the conceptual stuff.
Exactly. So it seems like, at least for now, researchers are viewing LLMs as more of a productivity tool.
Rather than something that's fundamentally changing their approach to research.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. But here's where things get really interesting. Are you ready for this?
Always. Hit me.
40.5% of those who did use LLMs in their work, well, they didn't acknowledge it.
Whoa, hold on. They didn't mention using AI at all.
Nope. Didn't disclose it in their publications.
That's a pretty significant number. Why wouldn't they mention it? It seems, I don't know, almost counterintuitive, especially in academia.
I know, right? Transparency is so valued in the research world, so this finding was definitely a head-scratcher.
Do they explain why? What are the possible reasons for this?
Well, the study doesn't fully answer that question, unfortunately, but we can speculate.
Okay, let's speculate. What are your thoughts?
Well, one possibility is that there just aren't clear guidelines yet about how to acknowledge LLM use in research.
So maybe they're not sure how to do it properly or where to include that information.
Exactly. Or maybe, maybe there's this underlying perception that using AI tools might, I don't know, devalue their work in the eyes of their peers or reviewers.
Like it's seen as a shortcut. Or maybe even as, like, cheating.
It's possible. Or maybe they're worried about how it will be perceived by the broader scientific community.
Really makes you think about how the research community as a whole views the role of AI, right?
It's a big question. Do they see it as a legitimate research tool?
Or just as, a fancy shortcut.
It's a debate that's happening right now, for sure. And as these tools become more sophisticated and more integrated into research workflows, I think those questions are only going to become more pressing.
Absolutely. And speaking of the future, the study also asked researchers for their predictions about how LLMs will impact research in the years to come.
Okay, crystal ball time. What did they say?
Well, there was definitely a mix of optimism and caution.
That makes sense. It's a new technology with a lot of potential, but also a lot of unknowns.
Exactly. So on the one hand, the researchers believe LLMs will have a big impact on, well, the more technical aspects of research.
Like what, specifically?
Things like, grammar, editing, writing, and even literature reviews.
So kind of building on what we were just talking about, using LLMs as a way to streamline those more time-consuming tasks.
Exactly. Those tasks that, well, can be pretty tedious and time-consuming, and where AI's ability to process and analyze large amounts of text could really, streamline the process.
It's like having a super efficient research assistant or a tireless editor.
Right. Someone or something that can just churn through those tasks that would take a human hours or even days to complete.
Makes you wonder what researchers could accomplish if they had more time to focus on, the bigger picture stuff.
The more creative, conceptual aspects of research.
Exactly. But when it comes to those more, I don't know, conceptual and analytical aspects of research, well, the researchers were a bit more hesitant about AI's role.
Yes.
Things like methodology, choosing the right journal for publication, and even generating study ideas.
So those core elements of the research process, the areas where human expertise is still seen as crucial, at least for now.
Right. And I think that's really interesting because it shows that there's still a clear distinction in the minds of researchers between the tasks that they're comfortable delegating to AI, like those more technical writing tasks, and those where they still see human judgment and expertise as indispensable.
I'd love to hear your take on this. What makes those areas, those core research aspects, less susceptible to, well, to the influence of LLMs, at least for now?
Well, I think it comes down to the complexity and the nuance involved in those aspects of research.
Right. Those core aspects we were just talking about.
Exactly. Take methodology, for example.
Okay, methodology.
To really nail methodology, you need a deep understanding of different research designs,
Like knowing the strengths and weaknesses of each approach.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And knowing how to apply them, well, appropriately to a specific research question.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Not at all. It involves a lot of critical thinking, a lot of judgment, and, well, at least for now, AI just isn't fully equipped to handle that.
Yeah, it really makes you appreciate the human element in research, right?
Absolutely.
That ability to consider the context, to think about potential biases.
And the ethical implications of different approaches.
It's not just about crunching numbers or analyzing data. It's about making informed decisions.
Decisions based on, well, a whole range of factors.
And that human element is really important when it comes to things like choosing the right journal for your research, too.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much strategic thinking involved in that process.
Right. It's not just about finding a journal that publishes on a certain topic.
Nope. It's about understanding the scope of different journals,
Like there's specific areas of focus.
Right. And the preferences of their editorial boards.
Because every journal has its own personality, its own style.
Exactly. And then you have to think about the potential impact of publishing your work in a particular outlet.
Will it reach the right audience? Will it have the impact you're hoping for?
Exactly. So again, it's a very nuanced decision-making process, one that goes beyond, just identifying relevant keywords.
It seems like there's this clear distinction emerging then between the tasks that researchers are, comfortable delegating to AI.
Like those grammar and formatting tasks we were talking about.
Right. And those where they still see human expertise as indispensable.
Like those big picture decisions about methodology and publication strategy.
So it's not just about the technical capabilities of AI. It's also about how comfortable researchers are with letting go of certain aspects of the research process.
And trusting AI to handle those tasks.
But what about the emotional side of things? How are researchers feeling about the rise of LLMs?
Well, that's another fascinating aspect of the study. They actually asked researchers about their feelings.
So not just what they're doing with LLMs, but how they feel about them.
Exactly. And it turns out there are mixed feelings. More than half, so over 50%, view the impact of LLMs as positive.
So they see the potential benefits.
Definitely. But a significant portion, about a third of the researchers, are unsure.
They're not convinced yet.
Not quite. So there's this mix of, excitement about the possibilities.
But also some apprehension about what it all means for the future of research.
It's understandable, right?
Totally. We're talking about a technology that has the potential